if you're watching this, I need you to promise me one thing. Stay till the end, because if you leave now, you'll walk away thinking this is just another sad family story. It's not. This is a warning, and by the time I'm done, you'll understand why I'm the only one left to tell it. My name doesn't matter. Not anymore. What matters is what happened to the 5 people who used to sit around our dinner table every Sunday, laughing like nothing in the world could ever break us. My father, my mother, my 2 older brothers, and my grandfather, the man who built everything we had from nothing but a rusted toolbox and a stubborn refusal to quit. We weren't always rich. I remember the small house with the leaking roof, the winters where we wore 2 sweaters instead of turning up the heater, the summers where ice cream was a luxury we split 4 ways. But we had something money can't buy. We had each other. My father used to say it every night before bed, "As long as we're together, we're the richest family on this street." I believed him. I believed him with my whole heart. Then my grandfather's business exploded. Not literally, financially. A patent he'd been sitting on for 15 years suddenly became worth more than any of us could comprehend. Overnight, we went from counting coins to counting zeros. And that's when I first noticed it. That small, cold shift in my father's eyes whenever grandfather mentioned the word inheritance. I was 12 years old, too young to understand the weight of what was forming at that table, but old enough to feel it. The way the air changes right before a storm, the way dogs get restless before an earthquake nobody else can sense yet. I felt it in my bones before I ever saw it with my eyes. My grandfather was a wise man, wiser than any of us gave him credit for. He didn't hand out his wealth like candy. He said money without character was a loaded gun in the hands of a child. So he did something none of us expected. He wrote a will, a real one, sealed, witnessed, ironclad, and he told us exactly what was in it. Not to brag, not to tempt us, but to test us. He wanted to see who we'd become once we knew what was coming. That single decision was the beginning of the end. My oldest brother, Arav, was 22 then. Sharp, ambitious, the kind of person who could charm a locked door into opening itself. He started visiting grandfather more often after that, bringing him tea, reading him the newspaper. Small things, loving things on the surface. But I caught him once, in the hallway, on the phone with someone I didn't recognize, saying words that didn't belong to a grandson who loved his grandfather. He was asking about something called a revised beneficiary clause. I was 12. I didn't know what that meant. But I understood the tone. I understood greed even before I had a word for it. My second brother, Kabir, was quieter, colder. He didn't bother with the performance Arav put on. He simply watched, calculated, waited. If Arav was fire, Kabir was ice. And somehow ice felt more dangerous, because you never saw it coming until you were already frozen. And my parents, God, my parents. I want to protect their memory, I really do. But this story deserves the truth. And the truth is that my mother started keeping a private ledger. A little notebook she thought no one knew about, where she wrote down everything grandfather owned. The properties, the stocks, the old watch he wore every single day, the one that had belonged to his own father. She wasn't cataloging memories, she was cataloging value. My father was the worst of them all, and it breaks something in me to say that, because he was also the man who taught me how to ride a bicycle, who stayed up all night when I had a fever, who once gave away his winter coat to a stranger on the street because nobody should be cold beta. That man still existed somewhere inside him, but another version of him had started growing in the shadows, feeding on every zero that appeared in grandfather's bank statements. I watched my family, the same family that had huddled together under one blanket during power cuts, that had shared one plate of food during hard months and called it a feast, slowly transform into strangers wearing familiar faces. The love didn't disappear all at once. It eroded, quietly, like water wearing down stone, so slow you don't notice the shape has changed until one day you look up and the mountain is gone. Grandfather noticed too. He wasn't blind. He wasn't foolish. One evening he called me into his study, just me, not my brothers, not my parents. And he held my hands in his and said something I will never, ever forget as long as I live. Beta, greed doesn't announce itself with a knock on the door. It slips in through the cracks love leaves behind, and once it's inside a house, it doesn't leave until it's taken everything, including the people. I didn't understand him then. I was just a child holding her grandfather's trembling hands, nodding because I loved him, not because I comprehended the weight of what he was telling me. I understand him now, Every single word. Because 6 months later, on a rainy Tuesday night that I will describe to you in detail in the next part of this story, my grandfather changed his will one final time. And that decision, that one piece of paper, set into motion a chain of events that would take everyone I loved from this world. One by one, in ways so horrifying that even now, years later, I still wake up at 3 a.m. hearing my mother's voice, screaming, "If you think you know where this story is going, you're wrong, stay with me." Because what happened next wasn't just a family falling apart over money. It was something far darker than greed alone could explain. The rainy Tuesday I promised to tell you about started like any other evening in our house. The smell of my mother's cooking drifting through the hallway, the television murmuring some cricket match my father pretended to watch while actually reading something on his phone. My brothers upstairs, doors closed, the way they always were now. And me, 13 years old by then, sitting on the staircase where I could see everyone and no one could see me. That staircase became my favorite place in the house. It was the only place I could watch my family without them performing for me. Grandfather called a meeting that night. He didn't do that often. When he did, everyone came, because when grandfather spoke, the whole house listened, not out of fear, but out of a respect that had been earned over 60 years of hard work and harder honesty. He sat at the head of the table, the same seat he'd sat in every Sunday for as long as I could remember, and he placed a thick envelope in front of him. "I've made a decision," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. A tiredness that went deeper than age. "I've rewritten my will." I watched my father's jaw tighten. I watched my mother's hand freeze mid-motion over her teacup. I watched Arav lean forward just slightly, like a predator catching a scent, and I watched Kabir not move at all, which somehow felt worse. "I'm leaving everything," grandfather continued, "to a trust. One that none of you can touch directly. It will be used to fund a school in the village where I was born. The house, the properties, the accounts. All of it goes into that trust the day I die." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on your chest like a hand. "Why?" my father finally asked, and his voice cracked in a way I had never heard before. Grandfather looked at each of them, one by one, and then he looked at me, sitting on the staircase where I thought I was hidden. He smiled at me. Actually smiled, warm and sad at the same time. Before turning back to the others. Because I watched what money did to this family before it even arrived. I can only imagine what it will do once it's actually here. My father stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He said things that night I won't repeat, not because I'm protecting him, but because some words, once spoken aloud, can never be unheard, and I don't want to give them a second life by putting them in this story. My mother cried, though I couldn't tell if it was for the money or for the man who was slipping away from her, or maybe by then those two things had become impossible to separate. Arav left the house and didn't come back until morning. Kabir just sat there silent, calculating, his eyes fixed on grandfather like he was solving a puzzle none of the rest of us could see. I stayed on those stairs until nearly midnight, until the house had gone quiet except for the sound of rain hammering against the windows. And that's when I saw my mother go into grandfather's study. Alone. I don't know what she said to him. I only know that when she came out, her face had changed. Something in her had settled, like a decision had been made, and there was no turning back from it. 3 weeks passed. Grandfather started getting sick. Small things at first. Headaches he waved off. Dizziness he blamed on his age. A tremor in his hands he joked about, saying he was getting old and clumsy. I was the only one who seemed worried. I begged my mother to take him to a doctor. She told me not to worry, that old men get tired, that this was normal. It wasn't normal. I know that now. The dizziness got worse. The headaches became migraines that left him curled up in a dark room for hours. He started forgetting things, small things, then bigger things, then things that terrified me, like the day he looked at me and, for just a moment, didn't seem to know who I was. My father called it early stages of something. My mother nodded along. My brothers barely visited his room anymore, as if his decline made them uncomfortable. As if weakness in the man who once seemed unbreakable was something they couldn't bear to witness. But I visited him every single day. I held his hand through the worst of it, and on one of his clearer days, in a whisper so quiet I had to lean in to hear him, he said something that has haunted every single day of my life since. "Betta, the tea tastes different lately." I didn't understand. I was 13. I thought maybe his taste buds were changing, the way old people's senses do. I told him it was probably nothing. I told him to rest. I wish, more than anything I have ever wished for in my life, that I had asked him what he meant. I wish I had taken that sentence and turned it over in my hands until it made sense. Because 3 days later, my grandfather, the strongest, wisest, most unshakable man I had ever known, collapsed in his study and never opened his eyes again. The doctors called it a stroke, natural causes, age catching up with a body that had worked too hard for too many years. Everyone accepted it, everyone except me, because I remembered the tea. I remembered my mother's face when she left his study that rainy night. I remembered Kabir's calculating silence and Araf's disappearing act and my father's broken voice shouting things I still won't repeat. And 3 days after we buried him, before the flowers on his grave had even begun to wilt, my family sat down together, not out of grief, but out of hunger, to read a will they didn't yet know had already been changed one final time. What they found inside that envelope would tear my family apart in ways none of them could have imagined. And it would mark the beginning of the deaths that followed. The lawyer's name was Mr. Kapoor, a small, precise man with reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose, and a briefcase that looked older than my grandfather had been. He sat at the same dining table where grandfather once announced his decision, and he opened that same thick envelope in front of the same 5 people who had once sworn, over and over, in different ways, on different days, that they loved him more than they loved his money. I wasn't supposed to be in the room. 13-year-olds don't get invited to will readings. But I hid in the hallway again, on the other side of that same staircase, because by then I had learned that the truth in my house only ever revealed itself in the spaces between rooms, never inside them. Mr. Kapoor cleared his throat and began to read. The trust was real, the school in the village, the properties, most of the wealth, exactly as grandfather had announced that rainy night. But there was an addition, a codicil added just 2 weeks before he died, so recent the ink practically still smelled fresh. To my family, Mr. Kapoor read, his voice flat and lawyerly, completely unaware of the bomb he was about to detonate. AFT, not money, not property, a choice. He explained it slowly, the way lawyers do when they know a document is about to ruin someone's life and want to make absolutely sure there's no room for misunderstanding later. Grandfather had left behind a single locked box, hidden somewhere on the family estate. Inside that box was a letter and a key to a separate account, one that had not been mentioned in any previous version of the will, one worth more than every other asset combined. He hadn't told anyone where the box was. He had only left clues, scattered in journals, in old letters, in places only someone who truly knew him, who had truly listened to him, truly loved him for who he was rather than what he had, would think to look. Whoever finds the box, Mr. Kapoor read, finds the truth of who in this family loved me, and who loved what I could give them. I trust that truth to reveal itself. The silence after that sentence was different from every silence before it. It wasn't shock. It was hunger, unleashed and finally given permission to show itself. I want you to understand something about my family before I tell you what happened next. These were not evil people, not at the start. My father used to carry me on his shoulders through crowded markets so I wouldn't get lost. My mother used to sing to me in a voice so soft I still hear it sometimes in my dreams. Araf taught me how to swim. Kabir, despite his coldness, once sat with me for 6 straight hours when I had chickenpox, just so I wouldn't be scared alone. These were people capable of love. Real love. But grandfather had built a test that didn't ask who could love. It asked who could resist greed, when greed was dangled in front of them, like a key to everything they'd ever wanted. And one by one, they all failed it. Within a week, my father had turned grandfather's study inside out, tearing through decades of journals with a franticness that scared me. My mother started, helping, searching the same rooms my father searched, but secretly at night, when she thought he was asleep, looking in places she didn't want him to know she'd looked. Arav disappeared for days at a time, visiting old family properties, asking staff members questions, offering money for information. And Kabir, quiet, patient Kabir, simply sat in grandfather's study every evening, reading his old letters one by one, searching not for the box itself, but for the man who had hidden it, trying to think the way he thought. The house that had once smelled like my mother's cooking now smelled like dust and old paper and something else. Something I couldn't name back then but can name now. Suspicion. It has a smell, I promise you. It smells like a held breath. 3 weeks into the search, Arav found something. A letter. Tucked inside an old ledger in one of the outer properties, written in grandfather's handwriting, describing a location that matched an old family shed near the edge of our land. A shed nobody had used in over a decade. He didn't tell anyone. He went alone at night, without a word to a single member of the family. He never came back. We found him the next morning. The shed had partially collapsed, old wood, old nails, decades of neglect, and a support beam had come down directly on him while he searched through boxes stacked along the back wall. The police called it a tragic accident. A structure that should have been condemned years ago, finally giving way under the weight of someone disturbing it. I remember standing at his funeral, 13 years old, watching my mother collapse against my father's shoulder, watching Kabir stand perfectly still with an expression I couldn't read, and thinking, for the first time, though not the last, that something about this didn't feel like an accident at all. Because 2 days before he died, I had overheard Kabir on the phone, in a voice colder than I had ever heard him use, saying, "He's getting too close. Someone needs to slow him down." I told myself I misheard him. I told myself grief was making me imagine things that weren't there. I was a child who had just lost her brother, and children look for someone to blame, because blame feels better than randomness, better than a universe that lets support beams fall on people we love for no reason at all. But I hadn't misheard him, and Arav's death wasn't the last accident my family would suffer. It wasn't even the strangest one. Because 4 months later, my mother found the box, and what was inside it didn't just reveal who loved grandfather and who loved his money. It revealed something about our family's past that none of us, not even my father, had ever known. A secret buried so deep, so carefully, that finding it would cost my mother everything, in a way far more horrifying than falling wood and broken beams. I lay there frozen, the hand pressed over my mouth so tightly I could taste the salt of my own fear. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard I was certain whoever was standing over me could hear it. And then, finally, the voice came, a whisper, low and shaking, closer to a sob than a threat. "Please don't scream. Please. I just need to talk to you." It was Arav. The hand lifted from my mouth, and in the moonlight slicing through my curtains, I saw my older brother's face. And it wasn't the face of a monster. It was the face of a man who hadn't slept in weeks, hollow-eyed, trembling, undone. He sat on the edge of my bed and put his head in his hands, and for a moment, 13-year-old me forgot to be afraid and simply felt sorry for him. "I heard something," he whispered. "Downstairs. 2 nights ago. Ma and Papa talking. I don't think you should be alone in this house anymore." I asked him what he heard. He wouldn't tell me at first. Kept saying it was probably nothing, that he was probably overreacting, that grief made people say things they didn't mean. But I pressed him, the way children press adults when they sense a truth is being kept from them, and eventually he broke. "They were talking about the trustee review," he said, "the one who's supposed to decide in 2 years whether Kabir and I get our share. Ma said if something happened to you before you turned 25, before the trust matured, your portion would default back into the family estate." The room went very cold. "She was talking about you like." Arav stopped himself, shook his head, and looked at me with an expression I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "I need you to be careful. I need you to lock your door. I need you to stop eating anything Ma cooks unless I've seen her cook it myself. Can you do that for me?" I want to tell you I trusted him completely in that moment. I didn't, not fully. How could I, after everything? But some instinct in me, some old childhood memory of him carrying me on his shoulders through a crowded market, told me he was telling the truth, at least about this. So I nodded, and he squeezed my hand before disappearing back into the darkness of the hallway, and I didn't sleep again that night. For the next 2 months, Arav became my shadow. He drove me to school himself instead of letting the driver take me. He started eating dinner in my room with me, claiming he wanted sibling time. Though we both knew what he was really doing was making sure nothing was slipped into my food. Kabir noticed. Kabir always noticed everything, and one evening, over a dinner Arav had insisted on sharing with me. Kabir appeared in my doorway and simply stared at the two of us for a long, uncomfortable moment before saying, "Isn't it sweet how protective you've become of our little Hires?" The way he said, "Ires," made my skin crawl. 3 weeks later, Arav was dead. They called it a car accident. Brakes failed on a road he drove every single day, a road he knew better than the lines on his own palm. The police report said nothing suspicious, no signs of tampering, just an unfortunate mechanical failure on a rainy night. The second rainy night to change my life forever. But I remember something the mechanic said to my mother when he came to collect the wreckage, something I wasn't supposed to hear. Something he said quietly, almost apologetically. The brake lines weren't worn out, ma'am. They were cut clean. My mother told him he was mistaken. She thanked him for his condolences and closed the door in his face. I stopped speaking after that. Not because I couldn't. Because I didn't trust a single word that might come out of my mouth, didn't trust who might be listening, didn't trust which family member might use my grief as another piece on whatever board they were playing this horrible game on. I went to Arav's funeral in silence. I stood beside his grave in silence. I watched my mother cry tears I could no longer tell were real, and I watched Kabir stand perfectly still with an expression I had come to recognize. The look of a man doing math in his head, recalculating percentages now that one competitor had been removed from the equation. I should have run then. I know that now. I should have gone to the police, to a teacher, to anyone who might have listened to a grieving, terrified 14-year-old girl. But grief is a strange paralysis. It convinces you that the worst has already happened, that you're safe now simply because the universe has already taken its toll. I was wrong. The universe, or rather, my own family, was just getting started. My father began drinking heavily after Arav's death, disappearing into the study for hours, emerging only to mutter apologies to no one in particular. To a version of his father he could no longer ask for forgiveness. My mother, meanwhile, grew colder, sharper, more desperate, as if Arav's death had stripped away whatever thin veneer of maternal instinct had still been holding her together. And Kabir began spending long hours with Mr. Chaudhary, the family lawyer, asking questions about trustee timelines, about accelerated maturity clauses, about what would happen to my share of the inheritance if I were declared, in his words, unfit to manage such responsibility. He was building a case against me, against my own sanity. I found notebooks in his room once, when he wasn't home, notebooks filled with dates, times, observations about my behavior, phrases like, appears withdrawn, possible signs of psychological instability following brother's death, consider consulting a psychiatrist for evaluation. He wasn't documenting concern. He was building evidence piece by piece to have me declared incapable, to have my inheritance redirected into hands he controlled. I realized, with a clarity that terrified me more than anything else in this entire story, that I was now completely alone in that house. My grandfather was gone. My protector was gone. And the two people who remained under that roof with me, my mother and my brother, had transformed into something I no longer recognized as family at all. On the 1-year anniversary of my grandfather's death, my mother called me into the kitchen and handed me a cup of tea, smiling in a way she hadn't smiled at me in over a year. "Drink up, Beta," she said. "You look tired." And I finally understood, with my grandfather's whispered warning echoing in my ears from beyond the grave, exactly what he had meant about the taste of tea. I didn't drink it. What I did instead, what I found hidden in that kitchen that night, and what it revealed about everyone I had ever trusted, is something I need you to hear in full, because it changes everything you think you understand about this story. I didn't drink the tea. Instead, I told my mother I felt sick to my stomach and asked to be excused, and the moment her back was turned, I poured it into the small potted plant by the kitchen window. The same plant, I would later learn, that withered and died within 3 days. I went to my room that night, locked the door, pushed my dresser against it, and sat awake until sunrise, staring at the wood grain of that door like it might come alive. The next morning, I did something I should have done a year earlier. I called Mr. Chaudhary. I told him everything. The tea grandfather mentioned before his death, Arav's warning about the trustee clause, the cut brake lines the mechanic had whispered about, Kabir's notebooks filled with fabricated evidence of my instability, my mother's smile the night before, and the cup of tea she'd handed me with hands that didn't shake even slightly. Mr. Chaudhary listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long silence on the line before he finally spoke. "Your grandfather suspected something like this might happen," he said quietly. "He left instructions with me. Instructions I was only to act on if you ever called me sounding exactly the way you sound right now. It turned out my grandfather, wise even in his final months, had installed a hidden condition in the will that none of us had been told about. Not even, I believe, Mr. Chaudhary himself until that final week of his life. If any beneficiary was found, through independent investigation, to have caused harm to another beneficiary in pursuit of the inheritance, their share would be immediately forfeited, and a private investigator retained years earlier by my grandfather, a quiet, careful man named Inspector Verma, an old friend from grandfather's army days, would be activated to formally investigate. Within a week, Inspector Verma had reopened the case of Arav's accident. The mechanic who'd been silenced by my mother's cold stare a year earlier was re-interviewed, and this time, under formal questioning, he confirmed what he'd tried to say the first time. The brake lines showed clean, deliberate cuts, consistent with a specific type of tool later found, wrapped in an old cloth, hidden in the back of Kabir's car. Kabir didn't confess easily. He never confessed at all, actually, not with words. But 3 days after Inspector Verma brought him in for questioning, alone in a holding room, waiting for his lawyer, my brother did something none of us saw coming. He had smuggled a small blade in the lining of his jacket, one he'd hidden there long before, perhaps as insurance for a moment just like this one. When the guard checked on him 20 minutes later, it was already too late. He left no note, no apology, no explanation, just silence, the same silence he had perfected his entire life, extending itself into the only place left for it to go. My mother was arrested 2 days later, charged as an accomplice to attempted poisoning, based on toxicology results that came back from that dying potted plant. Trace amounts of a slow-acting compound, one that mimicked the natural decline of an elderly man's failing body almost perfectly. She was also charged, though never fully proven, in connection with the substance that had been slipped into my grandfather's tea in his final weeks. She never admitted guilt. In the one conversation I had with her before the trial, through a thick glass partition in a visitation room that smelled like bleach and regret, she looked at me with eyes that held no remorse at all, only a kind of cold, wounded pride. Everything I did, she said, I did for this family. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to a woman who had confused love with ownership her entire life, who believed that raising a child meant being owed something in return, who had watched greed consume her own children and called it inheritance planning. My father didn't survive the trial either. Not in body, but in every way that mattered. He drank himself into a hospital bed within months, his liver failing under the weight of everything he'd buried inside himself. I visited him once, at the very end, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of the man who used to give his coat to strangers on cold streets. He held my hand and whispered that he was sorry, that he didn't know how it had all gone so wrong, that somewhere between the small house with the leaking roof and the mansion built on grandfather's fortune, he had lost himself entirely. He died 3 days later. I don't know if I forgave him. I don't know if forgiveness is even the right word for what I feel when I think of him now. Grief and anger can occupy the same heart at once. I know that better than anyone. My mother is still in prison. She writes me letters I never open. I am the only one left. The girl on the staircase, the one nobody thought to watch closely enough, the one who inherited not just money, but the full and terrible weight of what that money cost. I turned 25 last spring, the trust matured. The inheritance became mine in full, exactly as my grandfather intended, not as a prize, but as a responsibility. A scar shaped like a fortune. I used most of it to build that school in the village where he was born, the one he'd always dreamed of, the one that started this entire tragedy the moment my family realized they might not get everything they believed they deserved. It felt like the only way to make his death mean something more than the greed that surrounded it. Some nights, I still hear my mother's voice offering me that cup of tea, still smell the bitter steam rising off a decision that would have ended my life the same way it ended my grandfather's and my brother's. And on those nights, I remind myself of the lesson this entire nightmare tried to teach me, the one grandfather understood long before any of us. That love, real love, doesn't calculate what it's owed. It doesn't count zeros. It doesn't cut brake lines or poison tea or fabricate evidence in hidden notebooks. My family chose greed over love, and they paid the ultimate price for that choice. Every single one of them. I am the only one who survived to tell you why. And if there's one thing I hope you carry with you after hearing this story, it's this: money will never love you back. Choose the people who do, before it's too late to choose at all. I've told you everything now. Every secret my family buried, every lie they dressed up as love, every choice that led 5 people to a table they thought they'd share forever, and left only one of us standing to clear it. I used to think this story was about money. It isn't. Money was just the mirror. It didn't turn my father into a man who could shout things he could never take back. It didn't turn my mother into someone who could hand her own daughter a cup of poison with a steady hand. It didn't cut a brake line or hide a blade in a jacket lining. All money ever did was show me who they already were, underneath the Sunday dinners and the bedtime stories and the years of pretending. It didn't create the greed. It just stopped them from hiding it. That's the part I need you to understand, because it's the part that took me the longest to learn. Greed doesn't arrive wearing a warning label. It doesn't knock. It slips in through the same door as love, wearing the same face, using the same voice that once told you it loved you more than anything in this world. And by the time you realize the two have traded places, it's already sitting at your table, eating from your plate, sleeping down the hall from your bedroom. I don't tell you this story so you'll pity me. I've had enough years, enough silence, enough locked doors and untouched cups of tea to make peace with pity and set it down. I tell you this story because somewhere out there, right now, there's a family sitting around a table just like mine used to, smiling for now, loving for now, while something cold and patient begins to grow in the spaces between them. Maybe it's an inheritance. Maybe it's a business. Maybe it's something as small as who gets the bigger room, or whose name goes first on a deed. It doesn't take a fortune to poison a family. It only takes the belief that you are owed more than the people who are supposed to love you. My grandfather knew that. He knew it before any of us were willing to see it, and he tried to warn us the only way he knew how, not with money, but with a lesson wrapped inside of it, a test none of us passed except, in the end, by surviving it. I didn't win anything the day that trust matured. I inherited a fortune built entirely out of loss. I would trade every rupee of it, every property, every account, to have one more Sunday dinner with a family that actually loved each other instead of measuring each other. But I don't get that Sunday. None of us do. Once greed finds its way into a home, that's the price. Not a fine, not a debt, a permanent, irreversible ending, paid in full by people who thought they still had time to make it right. So if you take one thing from everything I've shared with you tonight, let it be this: look around your own table. Look at the people sitting beside you, the ones who've been there through the leaking roofs and the thin winters, long before there was ever anything worth fighting over. Choose them. Choose them again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day money tries to convince you there's something more valuable in the room. Because there isn't. There never was. My family learned that lesson too late, and it cost them everything.